Hey y'all, so today we're going to go back into chapter 10, which is pretty long, and we're going to start this story called The Little Match Girl. And I remember now why this story stuck with me for so long. I just couldn't remember the details from the first couple of times I read it actually. But it's I want to go ahead and tell you it is a sad story, so if you're sensitive to those kind of things, you may want to skip this. But it's got great lessons, and I'm looking forward to it. I'm feeling okay. Thank you for your prayers, and I'm just ready for winter to be over. I'm so ready for warm weather and for sickness to just go away, and for all of us. And I want us to all be healthy and happy and peaceful and most definitely safe as a foundation for all that. And so as we're continuing to go through the book and learn the lessons together, I just hope that you continue to be motivated and inspired, and like I said, please just take this into your own mind to get the wheels turning, to help add to your own truths. I don't ever want you to take my opinions in as your truths. I believe that it's good to question things, and to do some deep thinking and critical thinking, and I just always encourage you to do that. That's my philosophy in life anyway. So okay, let's get started. So the first section is called Focus and the Fantasy Mill. It's kind of like an introduction to the story, so I'm going to read a little bit to you. In North America, the tale called The Little Match Girl is best known in the Hans Christian Andersen version. It describes what lack of nurture, lack of focus look like and what they lead to. It is a very old tale, told the world over in various ways. Sometimes it is a charcoal burner who uses his last coals to warm himself while he dreams of times past. In some versions, the symbol of matches is exchanged for something else, as in The Little Flower Seller, about a broken-hearted man who gazes into the centers of his last flowers and is spirited away from this life. Though some might look at the superficial story rendering and say these are maudlin stories, I think that's how you say that, meaning they have excessive emotional sweetness, it would be a mistake to dismiss them lightly. The stories actually are, at their base, profound expressions of psyche, being negatively mesmerized to the point where real and vibrant life begins to die in spirit. Yes, which is how it feels when you're deeply entangled with a narcissist for some time. It does feel like your spirit is dying. And so I think that this story is really going to resonate with us for the purpose of having been through narcissistic abuse. I think that, and I think that reading things like this and talking about it can be healing. It's kind of like it's validating. You feel seen and heard through these stories sometimes because like I've mentioned before, and I know you know this, a lot of people are not going to be able to validate you and what you've been through, and in fact they can wind up making you feel worse if you finally decide to open up to somebody, and share what you've been through. They may look at you like you're crazy because, again, you know how hard it was for us to accept how evil is real and operates in our lives, not just in the world, but in our own lives. You know how hard that was to accept? Well, there's so many others who still haven't accepted that evil is real. And so when you share these kind of things, it's like I view it like they're not ready. They're just not ready to hear it, So I think that a lot of times our validation can come from one another, those of us who have been through it, certainly, and also stories like this. So let's get into it and read The Little Match Girl. I am going to read this story to you. So it says, there was a little girl child who had neither a mother nor a father, and she lived in the dark forest. There was a village at the edge of the forest, and she had learned she could buy matches for a half-penny there, and that she could sell them on the street for a full penny. If she sold enough matches, she could buy a crust of bread, return to her lean-to in the forest, and sleep there dressed in all the clothes she owned. The winter came, and it was very cold. She had no shoes, and her coat was so thin she could see through it. Her feet were past the point of being blue. Her toes were white. So were her fingers and the end of her nose. She wandered the streets and begged strangers. Would they please buy matches from her? But no one stopped, and no one paid her any attention. So she sat down one evening, saying, "I have matches. I can light a fire and I can warm myself." But she had no kindling and no wood. She decided to light the matches anyway. As she sat there with her legs straight out in front of her, she struck the first match. As she did, it seemed that the cold and the snow disappeared altogether. What she saw instead of swirling snow was a room, a beautiful room, with a great dark green ceramic stove with a door with iron scrollwork. The stove emanated so much heat it made the air wavy, and she snuggled up close to the stove, and it felt heavenly. But all of a sudden, the stove went out, and she was again sitting in the snow, shivering so bitterly the bones in her face chimed. And so she struck the second match, and the light fell upon the wall of the building next to where she sat, and she could suddenly see through it. In the room behind the wall was a snowy cloth covering a table, and there on the table was china of the purest white, and on a platter was a goose that had just been cooked. And just as she was reaching for this, the vision disappeared. She was in the snow again, but now her knees and her hips no longer hurt. Now the cold was stinging and burning its way up her arms and torso, and so she lit the third match. And in the light of the third match was a beautiful Christmas tree, beautifully decorated with white candles and lacy ruffs, and beautiful glass ornaments, and thousands of little dots of light that she couldn't quite make out. And she looked up this enormous tree that went higher and higher and stretched further and further toward the ceiling until it became the stars in the heavens over her head. And a star blazed across the sky, and she remembered her mother had told her that when a soul dies, a star falls. And out of nowhere, her grandmother appeared, so warm and so kind, and the child felt so happy to see her. The grandmother picked up her apron and put it around the child, held her close with both arms, and the child was content. But the grandmother began to fade, and the child struck more and more matches to keep the grandmother with her, and more matches to keep the grandmother with her, and more. And they began to rise together into the sky where there was no cold and no hunger and no pain. And in the morning, between the houses, the child was found still and gone. This is a heartbreaking story. But again, it's a story, and it's full of metaphors and lessons for us. So let's dive into that. The next section's called Staving Off Creative Fantasy, because clearly that's what was going on in this story, right? The little girl she essentially gave up. It's a story about giving up. It says, this child is in an environment where people do not care. If you are in one of these, get out. The child is in a milieu, I looked it up finally, milieu, where what she has, little fires on sticks, the beginnings of all creative possibility, is not valued. If you are in this predicament, turn your back and walk away. The child is in a psychic situation in which there are few options. She has resigned herself to her place in life. If this has happened to you, unresign yourself and come out kicking ass. When Wild Woman is cornered, she does not surrender. She comes ahead, claws out and fighting. What is the match girl to do? If her instincts were intact, her choices would be many. I want to pause here. I find it interesting that when I was in the thick of my issue, and I was constantly reading and looking for inspiration, you know, things like that. I've always been into personal growth and development and all this, but I heard about somebody talking about, you know, choosing a word of the year for yourself when the new year rolls around. So one year, a few years ago, my word was choice. And I know that might sound odd to some, and it was even odd to me, but somehow it resonated with me, you know, like on a soul level. And now I understand why. Because when your instincts are injured, you don't realize you have all the choices you do. So you are frozen. You're frozen. Like here. So, yes. It says, if her instincts were intact, her choices would be many. Walk to another town. Sneak into a wagon. Stow away in a coal cellar. Wild women would know what to do next. But the match girl doesn't know wild woman anymore. The little wild child is freezing inside, you know, our spirit. All that is left of her is a person who must go about in a trance. That's the whole feeling frozen thing, right? She gave up. She gave up. And we must never give up. Never give up. It says, being with real people, again, key word, real. This is what it says here. This is why it's so relevant, you know. Being with real people who warm us, who endorse and exalt our creativity is essential to the flow of creative life. Otherwise, we freeze. Yes, exactly. It says, nurture is a chorus of voices, both from within and without, that notices the state of a woman's being, takes care to encourage it, and if necessary, gives comfort as well. I'm not certain how many friends one needs, but definitely one or two who think your gift, whatever it may be, is pan de cielo, the bread of heaven. Yes, and you know, it talks about voices, it says from within and without, that notices the state of a woman's being. You need people who care enough to pay attention to you, who will look at you, true friends, who will look at you and, you know, without you even saying a word, they know if something's wrong, you know what I mean? Or if you're like, I'm good, they still know something's wrong. That's the kind of people you want in your life. And somebody who's just out to use you and manipulate you are not going to be looking at you that close. They don't care. Unless it's to exploit you, you know? So, this is such a rich section here. And she just talks about how we turn to fantasies when we're out in the cold. And she uses the symbolism of warmth and cold a lot. And, you know, because we're always talking about if somebody feels cold toward us, or if they feel warm, they feel like home, you know. But she just goes into details talking about that. And she just says that to avoid being the little match girl, there's one major action you must take. Anyone who does not support your art, your life, is not worth your time. Harsh but true. Exactly. So it says the match girl is not in an environment where she can thrive. There is no warmth, no kindling, no firewood. If we were in her place, what could we do? So she says, number one thing is don't entertain fantasies. As soon as you slip into that, it's you know, bad. So she then goes into breaking down fantasy, and she says there's 3 kinds of fantasies, which I found interesting. She says the first is pleasure fantasy. She calls it mind ice cream. Strictly for enjoyment, like daydreams. The second is intentional imaging, which is good because it's like you're planning. It says used as a vehicle to take us forward into action, like envisioning. I feel like, you know, like a vision board, or you know, envisioning in your mind. And then the third kind is the kind that brings everything to a halt. This is the kind of fantasy that hinders right action during critical times, and that's obviously what happened to little match girl. So she says, unfortunately, this is the kind that match girl spins. It is a fantasy that has nothing to do with reality. It has to do with feeling nothing can be done, so one might as well sink into idle fantasy. Exactly. It's giving up. It's giving up. Or losing your mind. So many different ways this can happen. And I think this is applicable if you reference the Bible verse to guard your thoughts and what we take in. And nobody's going to be in charge of our own mind like us. You know what I mean? So we're the gatekeeper. We're the guardsmen. And so we have to be careful. So what will reverse this and restore soul esteem and self-esteem? We have to find something very different than what the match girl had. We have to take our ideas. We have to take our ideas to a place where there is support for them. This is an enormous step. Very few of us can create solely under our own steam. We need all the pats from angel wings we can find. She talks about warm people. That's who you want in your life, warm people. Says that if any of us had been in her shoes, little match girl, nobody can thrive like that in that kind of environment. Since we want to put ourselves in a situation where, like the plants and the trees, we can turn toward the sun, but there has to be a sun. To do this, we have to move, not just sit there. We have to get up off the couch, and we have to motivate ourselves sometimes. Sometimes there's no one in our environment to do it, to help. So we have to be the ones to start that action, that right action, even though it may be the hardest thing we've ever done. Abuse is crippling. It's crippling. I'm talking about here, and sometimes physically. This is friends who love you and have warmth for your creative life are the very best sons in the world. It reminds me of that song, you are my sunshine. When a woman like the little match girl has no friends, she also becomes frozen by anguish and sometimes by anger as well, like getting stuck in rage, Even if one has friends, those friends may not be sons. This is interesting right here. They may give comfort instead of informing the woman about her increasingly frozen circumstances. They comfort her, but that is far different from nurture. Nurture moves you from one place to another. So this is like people who are true friends, who are willing to tell you hard truths, things that you're not willing to admit to yourself even. It's that whole iron sharpens iron thing. And that's a blessing to have people that care about us to that degree in our lives. But we have to be mature enough to be able to take in what those hard truths are that they're sharing with us, and understand it is for our benefit and that it's coming from a place of love. So it takes a certain level of maturity, you know what I mean? To not default into any kind of old wounded conditioning or limited thinking, but to think deeper, critically, and truly get to the heart and the truth of things. It takes a certain level of maturity to get there. So she talks about a frozen woman without nurture. I'm sorry, let me back up a little bit. It says, the difference between comfort and nurture is this. If you have a plant that is sick because you keep it in a dark closet and you say soothing words to it, that is comfort. If you take the plant out of the closet and put it in the sun, give it something to drink and then talk to it, that is nurture. Exactly. So a frozen woman without nurture is inclined to turn to incessant what-if daydreams. And so this is dangerous, especially if someone's still in a toxic environment or stuck in a narcissistic relationship, because that's where you're making excuses for that person. You're daydreaming, or you're not, it's more than daydreaming, you're stuck in that unhealthy type of fantasy where you're just lying to yourself that this person's going to, wake up and suddenly have a conscience one day and change. So, yes. It says, the little match girl has an internal grandmother who, instead of barking, wake up, get up, no matter what it takes, find warmth. Instead of that, she takes her away into a fantasy life and takes her to heaven. But heaven will not help the wild woman, the trapped wild child, or the little match girl in this situation. These comforting fantasies must not be ignited. They are seductive and lethal distractions from the real work. So she gets into talking about initiations And I feel like that's, like here, it's almost like a breakthrough in awareness, is how I see it. And she says, in initiations, spending a period of time under difficult conditions is part of a dismemberment from ease and complacency. And I think ease in this way is like not a good thing. Ease like just feeling comfortable with the familiar, even if the familiar is bad for you, is kind of how I see that. She says, as an initiatory passage, it will come to a conclusion, and the newly sanded down woman will commence a refreshed and enlivened spiritual and creative life. I view this as that cycle, You have to be willing, when you see things are not healthy, even though on the outside they may look good, like when, a narcissistic abuser may have that mask intact, and, you go along with it sometimes for years, but the truth. It's like when you're willing to admit that truth, it's going to catapult you down here. And it's hard to swallow those pills and to accept those hard truths. And I feel like when she says sanded down, it's kind of, I think of that. And then it's like, then you can start, she says, commits a refreshed and enlivened spiritual and creative life. That's when you can start this, And so, she says, historically and particularly in men's psychology, illness, exile, and suffering are often understood as an initiatory dismemberment, sometimes carrying great meaning. But for women, there are additional archetypes of initiation that rise out of women's innate psychology and physicality. Giving birth is one, the power of blood is another, as are being in love or receiving nurturant love. Being given the blessing by someone she looks up to, being taught in a deep and supportive way by one older than she, all these initiations that are intense and that have their own tensions and resurrections. The match girl could said to have come so close, yet remained so far from the transitional stage of movement and action that would have completed the initiation. While she has the materials for an initiatory experience in her wretched life, there is no one within or without to guide the psychic process. I'm wondering if you also have light bulbs go off when you're reading. Sometimes I do. And then you kind of like tuck them away for processing later. It says, psychically, in the most negative sense, winter brings the kiss of death. That is, a coldness to anything it touches. Coldness spells the end of any relationship. If you want to kill something, just be cold to it. As soon as one becomes frozen in feeling, thinking, or action, relationship is not possible. When humans want to abandon something in themselves or leave someone else out in the cold, they ignore them, disinvite them, leave them out, go out of their way to have to even hear their voice and lay eyes upon them. The way a narcissist treats you, basically. This is the situation in the psyche of the match girl. So, I want to go ahead and pause here. This section still has more to go. And then the next section is called Renewing the Creative Fire, which is great. So we'll probably go through that. And then the next story is called The Three Gold Hairs. So I'm anxious to look into that and see what that's got to offer for us. But I hope that this was validating for you. And I hope that it got the wheels turning some more. And I'd love to know your thoughts, as always, and I just appreciate you coming along this path with me, this journey with me, and I hope that you have a beautiful day, and I will see you soon.